Well, I mean, it was very poignant, to go there because, I mean, of course, it was nothing like pre-war Vilna in terms of the population or anything. And as I said, it was, now it's very different, but there wasn't really any recognition of the Jewish history, and nothing had been sort of fixed up, because it was just right after the fall of communism. But, there are parts of the old Jewish quarter that are very much physically intact. And, it was kind of a very powerful experience to just kind of walk in those streets, because it's still, unlike, let's say, Warsaw, where virtually the entire Jewish quarter was leveled with the destruction of the ghetto. There was a lot of damage in certain parts of the city in Vilna, the old city, but there's certain streets that are still there, and, you can walk down these narrow streets, and it's just like, you read about in Grade or something, and then you come to the part, this area that was the Schulhof, the synagogue courtyard, that was the most fabled, a part of the old city. And it's, that was completely leveled really by the Soviets. And there's a school there, and I think now there's some kind of statue, but at the time, there was nothing. So it's, it's very powerful to kind of see that, something that kind of evokes, that mood of the history, the Jewish history of the area, and then, you can almost see it sort of physically falling away when you come to just these gaps in the landscape, these areas that were flattened after the war, during the war, after the war, so, yeah, and then when I came back, I spoke to there was a volunteer at YIVO who was from Vilna. His name was Shlomo Kovarsky, that I was very close to, and I saw him after I went on this trip, and I thought he would be so proud, maybe not proud, but, he'd be pleased that I had visited Vilna, because he was, this kind of big patriot, of his hometown. And when I told him, he said to me, "What you saw, that was not Vilna." 'Cause of course, after the war, it's, it could never be the same, but of course, it was still very, I think, important for me to see it, physically what was there.
So I did the Vilna program in 2001, summer 2001. That was a fantastic experience. Did YIVO in 2002 and 2007. 2007 just to kind of ramp up in preparation for going to grad school, to get my Yiddish back, because I hadn't been speaking it for a couple of years. The Vilna program was very interesting just because it's as close as I've been to an immersive Yiddish program. We have students from all over the world, or who are speaking English, but also Yiddish, a higher proportion of Yiddish as the common language than I've had elsewhere. I'd like to. I might want to do it again at some point. I didn't allow myself to enjoy Lithuania as a country. I felt a real antipathy towards it. I was blindsided by the omnipresence of the Holocaust there, because my family had left before the Holocaust, and the first 2 weeks you're there, you're making all these trips. You're making a trip to Ponar, to these or you get a tour of the Vilna ghetto. You hear stories about this, the sliver of Jewish community that's left in the city now, and the fact that they don't always have the easiest time, about persistent kind of anti-Semitism, and it's just like I want it to be like I'm here to study Yiddish. I'm here to have this little world, and I feel like somehow to enjoy the country would be a betrayal of that. I felt a lot more when you talked early in the interview about tensions between different identities. I felt those tensions, and I felt like I'm a partisan in all the sense of the word, on behalf of the Jews that summer. And I think if I could go back now, I think I could look at it with a slightly larger lens. But that being said, I met some really wonderful people, and learned a lot of Yiddish. And it was, it was an extraordinary experience.
There was a Yiddishist named Abe Bornstein, who was a son of a gun. He was a tough character, but a lovable tough character. And I got to know him because when I was working for the American Friends at the Hebrew University, he was one of the people who was going to leave a major bequest. Every Friday, when I could no longer solicit, I would visit him at his small apartment in Brookline. Well, one day, Abe starts telling the story about Chaim Grade, and he says, I'm leaving more than 400 letters to the Hebrew University. I said, I don't know whether I said or they said, why do you have more than 400 letters? Because Chaim Grade would write to me every week. And one of the reasons was that Abe would make sure that Chaim Grade had money. He didn't give the money to Chaim Grade. He gave the money to the Jewish Studies Center at Harvard. Harvard would invite him to give a lecture at Harvard and pay him for the lecture so he could keep his dignity, get the money without feeling that Abe was giving him directly. It was a very clever way of doing it. So Chaim Grade would, write to Abe and thank him, and Abe, who knew no chachmas, said, what you're writing to me is narishkeit. If you're going to write me narishkeit, don't bother. But I want to know what you're thinking. I want to know what you're working on. I want to know what your next project is and what your attitudes on this and this and this. So I don't know what period of time we're talking about, but 400 letters? If he wrote one a week, that's got to be over a period of 8 or 9 years. And I don't know what they contain.
Well, my dad was born in 1897 in a little town outside of Odessa. We had a very, very nice social life. And I say we, I didn't have it, my parents had it, because there were always people coming to our home, famous writers and the intelligentsia. That's what I used to call them, because like Friday night or Saturday night was like a salon at our house. All these people that you read about years later were in my house talking to us, playing with us. And this was my father's, circle of friends. My father was very dapper also. He used to wear spats and walked with a cane and smoked a cigarette in a cigarette holder. And even when we tried to get him to stop smoking, he would still hold the cigarette holder in his mouth. We figured that, well, that couldn't be as bad as smoking. He smoked a lot. He smoked Pall Mall. I remember that. And those were the worst possible cigarettes you could smoke.
My contact, or my meeting, and then my studies as an undergraduate with Ruth Weiss, prior to her being hired away by Harvard, would have to be the key intellectual transition, because I took a seminar with her on Yiddish poetry in interwar Poland. I'm not sure if the seminar was about Jung Vilne. It may have been, but it was certainly about Vilne as an organizing principle for understanding modern Jewish culture. And as I went through graduate school, certainly the influences of Sutzkever and Grade continued to resonate. I found them interesting, and when coming up with a graduate project, it became clear that very little work had been done on Yiddish literary groups. Seth Wolitz has written a number of very important articles on groups, but no full-length sort of archival biographies that are both group biographies and literary analyses and cultural histories hadn't been done. And it was actually Ruth who was working on one about Die Junge, which came out while I was a student, which provided, I think, as we were talking, sort of the understanding of, oh, this is a viable project. These are important writers who haven't really been written about in their earlier stages. This could be something that could really keep someone busy for a long time, and it certainly did keep me busy. I'm a linear thinker, and the challenge of balancing different personalities was a challenge. You know, you had leading personalities, minor voices, and the effort to figure out how to tell that story was one that I worked on both on my graduate dissertation and now recently have turned into a book. But intellectually, it wasn't only because these were important writers and because they were an important literary group that deserved to be written about. That was one part of it. I actually found it interesting. It occurred to me at one point when I was retitling the book, or the book manuscript that's now called When Yiddish Was Young, that we had become, in teaching my own students, I came to realize that students were attracted to Yiddish because they saw it as old. They saw it as quaint. They saw it as grandfatherly. So they attributed certain nostalgic feelings of loss and of an attempt to recapture aspects of identity that they weren't in control of. That's what Yiddish represented. And Jung Vilne, wasn't concerned with those things. It was about, it was young, by definition. It was active, it was politically engaged, it was culturally engaged. I mean, there was no sense of oldness in what they were doing at the time. For them, it was all new, vibrant, and exciting. So the opportunity to write this book was an opportunity to really reflect on a moment that we may have forgotten about, really when Yiddish was young, when Yiddish was the language of children, of young parents, of love, of betrayal, of politics, not of what it has become in the post-Churban period. So for me, that was interesting.